In this video covering Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death, we will focus on the duality of man and the Oedipal project, a variation on Freud's Oedipus complex. To begin with, Becker claims that man's existential dilemma is his paradoxical nature, the fact that he is half animal and half symbolic. The animal part is clear. We are biological organisms that have evolved over millennia. Yet, despite this, we have managed to create entire systems of meaning. We've created heroic systems, as we saw in the previous video. We've created society and individual personality. In other words, we are part symbolic. Becker writes, we might call this existential paradox the condition of individuality within finitude. Man has a symbolic identity that brings him sharply out of nature. He is a symbolic self, a creature with a name, a life history. He is a creator with a mind that soars out to speculate about atoms and infinity, who can place himself imaginatively at a point in space and contemplate bemusedly his own planet. This immense expansion, this dexterity, this ethereality, this self-consciousness gives to man literally the status of a small god in nature. Yet, in contrast to this, Becker goes on to explain how, at the same time as the Eastern sages knew, man is a worm and food for worms. This is the paradox. He is out of nature and hopelessly in it. He is dual, up in the stars and yet housed in a heart-pumping, breath-gasping body. To further understand this duality of man, it is useful to look at the slightly unusual psychoanalytic idea of anality. Becker writes on this matter, the anus and its incomprehensible, repulsive product represents not only physical determinism and boundness, but the fate as well of all that is physical, decay and death. This focus seems rather perverse and abstract initially, but we can see how this idea is part of many cultures and how attempts are made to hide the deterministic and corporeal nature of the body. For example, Becker writes, take the widespread practice of segregating women in special huts during menstruation, and all the various taboos surrounding menstruation. It is obvious that man seeks to control the mysterious processes of nature as they manifest themselves within his own body. The body cannot be allowed to have ascendancy over him. Man likes to think of himself as a god, as the creator of an entire symbolic reality, but the body and its processes bound him. They disgust him, they remind him of his finitude and his animality and his failure to become a truly symbolic being. In other words, his failure to become a true god. Naturally, he attempts to reject this and stop himself from accepting it. So he creates taboos surrounding bodily processes. One of the ways we reject the determinism of the body, as we have seen, is through projection in patriarchal societies where societies create taboos surrounding women's bodily functions specifically. Another way we do this, particularly in modern consumerist culture, is by creating the ideal male or female body that we ought to strive towards. We use filters and Photoshop to remove signs of aging or parts of our body that we dislike, usually excess fat, for example. For women, the ideal body is typically viewed as one that is slim with no extra fat and representing youth, for example, no wrinkles, no bags under the eyes, no grey hair, etc. A woman's body that is fat and has signs of age and stress is seen as unwomanly, and she feels a pressure to fix this by, for example, going on a strict diet or getting Botox or plastic surgery and so on. And for men, again, the ideal body must not contain too much excess fat, but mainly it must represent strength and vitality. A male's body that is frail and weak is seen as undesirable and unmanly, similarly with a man who is overweight and unathletic. The ideal male and female bodies are symbols of the triumph of beauty over the ugliness of aging and decay. However, the ideal body types are usually so exaggerated in media that they are unnatural and unhealthy. For example, the extremely skinny models on Instagram or the male bodybuilders with dangerously low levels of body fat. However, and this is the important point, the fact that our body ideals are unnatural is part of what makes them ideals in the first place. If we understand Becker, we can understand the reason for this. The reason is that we tell ourselves that we do not need to accept the flaws in our body. We are told that we are not bound by them and we can change them all, whether it be through diet or plastic surgery or editing pictures and so on. We don't want to accept that we are bound by the body and all of its supposed flaws and imperfections. We prefer to rebel against the natural processes of the body, such as aging, and desire to look good, or what society tells us looks good, by, for example, going on radical diets and editing our pictures, or never being content with how strong or muscular or lean we are. We prefer this over being a generally healthy individual with a natural body type that comes with aging, that comes with imperfections. We prefer to obey the symbolic reality of society's demands over accepting the natural contingency of the body, which we know from Becker represents animality, determinism, and boundedness. In a perverse kind of way, we strive to be unhealthy and unnatural because of these ideals we've set for ourselves. We strive to be unhealthily thin, to have an unhealthily low body fat, to look perfect with no blemishes, all because of what these represent. The triumph of symbolic reality, of society's ideal of beauty, over the animalistic flaws of the body. Perhaps the current popularity of gender politics and notions of gender fluidity and other new ideas such as transracialism reflects this very need of ours to reject the determinism of the body and instead constitute ourselves entirely symbolically. Becker writes, the upsetting thing about anality is that it reveals that all culture, all man's creative lifeways, are in some basic part of them a fabricated protest against natural reality, a denial of the truth of the human condition, and an attempt to forget the pathetic creature that man is. Now we understand the duality of man and our fetishization of symbols, we can better understand Becker's idea of the Oedipal project, a variation on Freud's conception of the Oedipus complex. To begin, let's look at how Becker summarizes Freud's idea of the Oedipus complex. In his view, in Freud's view, the boy child had innate drives of sexuality, and he even wanted to possess his mother. At the same time, he knew that his father was his competitor, and he held in check a murderous aggressiveness toward him. But Becker claims that Freud's view is mistaken, as the Oedipus complex is not purely sexual as Freud thought. Sexuality is not the primary repression, but instead consciousness of death is. Although the motivation, the primary repression, is different, the effects are still the same. Becker writes, today we realise that all the talk about blood and excrement, sex and guilt is true not because of urges to patricide and incest and fears of actual physical castration, as Freud thought, but because all these things reflect man's horror of his own basic animal condition, a condition that he cannot, especially as a child, understand, and a condition that, as an adult, he cannot accept. The guilt he feels over bodily processes and urges is pure guilt, guilt as inhibition, as determinism, as smallness, boundedness. It grows out of the constraint of the basic animal condition, the incomprehensible mystery of the body and the world. Now let's look more in depth at some of these strange ideas that the psychoanalysts had. Firstly, the desire to possess the mother while seeing the father as a threat. There is a stage in childhood, Becker writes, before the child is fully differentiated from his mother in his own consciousness, before he is fully cognizant of his own body and its functions. The mother, at this time, represents literally the child's life world. In other words, the child is fully dependent on the mother, and all the mother's actions are there to sustain and help the child who is helpless on their own. Logically, this leads the child to want to fully possess the mother, to keep her for himself, as she is the one who cares for him, who keeps him alive basically. Now, as a child, one is vulnerable and physically weak. One sees the strength of the father at an early age, Becker gives the example of the child seeing the father crush a rat that has got into the house. Now, the child is too young to properly understand the relative power relations in the world and believes that his father also possesses the strength to crush him just as he crushed the rat. The father, in a way, controls his life. He sustains it, but he could crush it at any moment, and the child hates this dependency. He needs to be in control of his own death. This is why the psychoanalysts write that the child holds a murderous aggressiveness towards the father. It is because the child is not physically strong enough to rebel against the father, so he holds this powerful hatred and spite and need to break free in himself. This is why Becker writes that the Oedipal project is the flight from passivity, from obliteration, from contingency. The child wants to conquer death by becoming father of himself, the creator and sustainer of his own life. Moreover, this dependency on the mother does not last forever and actually turns into a hatred and a need to break free from their dependency on the mother. As the child grows and begins to see that his mother is affected by bodily processes such as excretion, illness, and childbirth, and witnesses the primal scene, the site of sexual relations between the parents, he realizes that his mother is not this goddess of light that he previously imagined. Instead, she is a physical being at the mercy of bodily processes and animal desires. Becker writes how the mother must exude determinism, and the child expresses his horror at his complete dependency on what is physically vulnerable. So he ends up rebelling against the mother and the father as he desires both to reject determinism and to be the sustainer of his own life. This is the essence of the Oedipal project. Becker summarizes, the Oedipus complex is the Oedipal project, a project that sums up the basic problem of the child's life, whether he will be a passive object of fate, an appendage of others, a plaything of the world, or whether he will be an active centre within himself, whether he will control his own destiny with his own powers or not. We can now see how the Oedipal project reflects man's basic condition, his duality and his lifelong attempt to reconcile this paradox that he finds himself in. Thank you for watching. I hope you found the video useful, and do leave any questions or comments you have down below. Thank you again, and goodbye.